In the dawn of humanity, when the earth was still young and the echoes of Eden lingered in the air, two brothers stood at the heart of a tale that would shape the ages. One, a tiller of soil, driven by sweat and toil. The other, a shepherd, guided by quiet faith and devotion. But beneath the surface of their bond lay an unseen shadow, a growing rift that would lead to the first fracture of brotherhood, a sin so deep that the earth itself would cry out in mourning. This is the story of Cain and Abel, of envy's whisper, blood's voice, and the eternal mark left on a wandering soul. The garden's quiet morning. The morning sun poured softly through the trees, casting long golden shafts of light onto the dew-kissed earth. It was the kind of morning that seemed to hum with the whisper of new beginnings, the quiet pulse of life gently stirring as the world breathed in. Cain stood at the edge of a field, his hands gripped tightly around the rough handles of a plough, the reins of his oxen trailing behind him. His brow glistened with sweat as he urged the heavy beasts forward, the earth turning beneath the iron edge of the plough. The soil, dark and rich, parted with a low, satisfying groan, a reminder of the land's fertility. Cain's hands, calloused and rough, moved with the ease of years spent in toil, but his thoughts were far from the task at hand. There was a restlessness within him, something he could not shake, something that gnawed at the edges of his mind with each turn of the plough. He looked up occasionally, casting his eyes across the vastness of the land, which stretched out before him like an unyielding sea of earth, its edges curling into the horizon. His work, he knew, was vital, necessary for the survival of his family. Yet with each harvest, he found himself questioning the meaning of it all. No matter how hard he laboured, no matter how meticulously he cared for the crops, the land never seemed to give as abundantly as it did for Abel. Abel, his younger brother who had chosen a life among the flocks, a shepherd tending his sheep and offering them up to God with a humble heart. Abel's life in its simplicity seemed to flow so easily. His relationship with God was pure, unblemished, and there was a joy in his spirit that seemed to awaken the earth around him. Cain, by contrast, found himself bound to the earth, both a labourer and a prisoner of it. Though the land provided, it did so grudgingly, as if it held some secret from him, some deeper favour bestowed upon his younger brother. As Cain wrestled with the oxen, guiding them through the furrows, he could feel the weight of these thoughts press harder upon him. His gaze flickered toward Abel, who was far off in the distance, his figure small and peaceful, moving among the flock. Cain could hear the soft bleating of the sheep, the wind whispering through the branches of the trees. There was a peace in Abel's world, a stillness that seemed far removed from the work of the fields. He didn't understand it. Didn't understand why Abel's life seemed so blessed, while his own, though full of labour, felt so barren. Abel's approach to God was different from his. When Abel brought his offerings to the Lord, they were with a humble heart, a heart that rejoiced in what had been given. Cain, on the other hand, offered his labour, his sweat, his toil. His offerings were filled with the weight of expectation, the hope that this would be enough for God to recognise him, enough for his Father to see the worth of his work. But it was never enough. It was never more than what he gave, and that nagging feeling of inadequacy never left him, not for a moment. Yet Abel, in his quiet way, offered the firstborn of his flock, the finest lamb, and it was enough. Why? What did he lack that Abel possessed? What made Abel's offering so perfect in the eyes of God? Cain's frustration flared, a bitter storm rising inside him. His oxen slowed, sensing the unrest within their master. The quiet morning, once filled with the soft murmur of life, now felt heavy with unspoken tension. The sun climbed higher, casting sharp shadows across the field. The work that had once been a steady rhythm now seemed like an unending, fruitless struggle. It was in that quiet moment, standing in the fields, surrounded by the land that had been his father's gift, that Cain felt the first stirrings of something dark, something deep and unnameable. It was a feeling he could not shake, a gnawing hunger that he could not appease, a hunger to be seen, to be chosen, to be favoured. With a grunt, Cain turned back to his work, the plough biting into the soil once more, but his heart had already begun to shift. The quiet of the morning, once so peaceful, now felt like a storm gathering on the horizon, and Cain knew, deep within him, that this was only the beginning. The offering, Abel moved among the sheep with a peculiar grace. His quiet song carried on the breeze. A lamb bleated, and Abel knelt, his hands firm yet tender, selecting a young, unblemished lamb from the flock. The altar stood on a rise between the brothers' lands, a simple stone structure set under the expanse of the open sky. It was a place of meeting, a place where the unseen heavens touched the earth. Cain arrived first, placing his offering atop the stones with deliberate precision. The fruits glistened in the sunlight, and the grains were piled in neat heaps. He stood back, wiping his brow, and looked upon his work with a quiet pride. Moments later, Abel approached, carrying the lamb in his arms. The animal's white fleece shone in the sunlight, unmarred by the dust of the ground. Abel's steps were measured, his face serene as he reached the altar. With a solemn whisper, he placed the lamb upon the stones. He bowed his head, his hands lingering momentarily on the animal's side, and a stillness settled over the land. The response came like a whisper in the wind, a breath of divine presence that descended upon the altar. Abel's offering ignited with a sudden radiant flame, the light of heaven itself consuming the lamb in a blaze that left no trace. The fire burned bright and pure, a visible sign of God's favor. Cain's offering, by contrast, remained untouched. The fruits and grains sat atop the stones, vibrant yet lifeless, as though the heavens had turned their gaze away. The silence that followed was deafening, and Cain's chest grew tight with a bitterness that burned hotter than any flame. He looked at Abel, whose face was alight with quiet joy. Abel's lips moved in prayer, his voice a soft murmur of gratitude, his eyes glistening with the awe of one who had drawn near to the divine. Cain's hands clenched into fists. Why? The word burned on Cain's tongue, though he did not speak it aloud. His mind churned with questions. Was his labor not enough? Did the sweat of his brow mean nothing to the Creator? God's voice came, not in anger, but in sorrowful understanding. Cain, the voice said, resonant and gentle, why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it. The words struck Cain like a weight upon his shoulders. He felt the truth in them, yet they offered no solace. His chest heaved, and he turned away, unable to meet the gaze of the altar any longer. He walked back to his field, the sting of rejection coursing through him, each step heavy with the burden of unanswered questions. Abel lingered at the altar, his heart full, his hands clasped in prayer. He whispered a quiet blessing over his brother, though Cain could not hear it. Abel's gratitude was sincere, but it unknowingly became a wedge, driving deeper into the fragile bond between the brothers. The seed of resentment. Cain stood in the furrows he had ploughed, his hands gripping the wooden handle of his hoe as though it might anchor him. Cain's jaw tightened. He turned his attention back to his work. The scene replayed endlessly in his mind. Abel's offering engulfed in God's consuming fire, while his own, a lifetime of effort poured into the fruits of the ground, lay untouched. Favor, he muttered bitterly. The word tasted foul in his mouth. What was Abel's favor with God but an undeserved accident of fortune? Was it the flock Abel shepherded, the lamb he offered? Did Abel do anything more than Cain had done? He felt a presence behind him and turned sharply, startled. It was the wind, stirring the fields around him. But in that moment, Cain could almost hear the voice of God again, as it had spoken to him on the day of the offering. Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it. The words had rung with the weight of truth, but Cain had found no comfort in them. Rule over sin? The very idea seemed like an insult. God had not rejected Abel's offering. Why was Cain left to wrestle with such burdens while Abel walked freely in favor? The sound of footsteps approached from the path leading up the hill. Cain turned to see Abel descending toward him, his face open and untroubled. "Brother," Abel called, his voice warm. "What do you want?" Cain asked, his tone sharp. Abel paused a few steps away, his brow furrowing slightly. "You've been working hard all day. I thought you might want some water. I brought extra." "Water," he said, his voice thick with disdain. "Do you think that fixes anything?" Abel hesitated, his expression softening into something that resembled pity. "I didn't mean to offend you," he said gently. I only thought. Thought what? Cain snapped, cutting him off. That you'd bring your favour with you? That you'd come down from your hill and make everything right with a sip of water and a smile? Abel's face fell, and he looked at Cain for a long moment, his eyes filled with something Cain couldn't bear to name. Was it understanding? Compassion? Whatever it was, it felt like a knife twisting in Cain's chest. I don't know why God chose my offering, Abel said softly, but his favour isn't about comparison, brother. It's about the heart. Maybe it's not something we can see. Cain's fists clenched at his sides. He didn't respond, couldn't respond, as the words sank into him like stones into a well. Abel waited a moment longer, then placed the water skin on the ground between them and turned and left. Cain watched Abel go, his thoughts a tangled web of anger, shame, and something darker, a whisper of an idea, faint but insistent, that Abel's presence was the true source of his pain. The whisper grew louder as he stood in the field, and by the time the sun dipped below the horizon, it had planted itself firmly in his heart. Why not me? The question remained unanswered, but in its place another took root. Why him? And for the first time, Cain began to consider what the world might look like without Abel. The sin within. Cain stood frozen, the weight of what he was about to do pressing down on him like an invisible hand. His fingers tightened around the crude tool he carried, a farmer's implement that had, until this moment, known only the soft resistance of earth. Brother, Abel's voice carried easily over the quiet fields. He approached with the confidence of one who had never known betrayal. What did you want to show me? Just walk with me, Cain said, his voice tight. Abel nodded, falling into step beside him. They moved in silence, the earth crunching softly beneath their feet. The land seemed to hold its breath, every sound muffled, as if the very air knew the weight of what was to come. Have you thought more about what God said? Abel asked gently, breaking the quiet. Cain's grip on the tool tightened. I have thought of little else, he said. Abel glanced at him, his brow furrowing slightly. I don't understand why you're troubled, Cain. God's ways are not always easy to grasp, but he is just. Perhaps there is something more he desires from you, something beyond the crops of the field. Cain stopped walking. He turned to face Abel, his expression dark. You speak of justice, Abel, but tell me, what justice is there in this? I work until my hands bleed. I wrestle with the cursed ground every day of my life. And yet it is you he favours. You, with your simple flock and your idle prayers. Abel's face softened. It is not a matter of work, Cain. It is the heart. God looks at the heart. Cain's heart thundered in his chest, the words slicing through him like a blade. He looked down at his brother, who stood unarmed, open, unaware. A deep, primal rage bubbled up within him, a rage he could no longer contain. You speak as though you know his mind, Cain spat, his voice trembling with fury. But you are nothing, nothing more than a boy playing at righteousness. Abel's eyes widened, but before he could respond, Cain moved. It was quick, almost instinctive. The tool in his hand swung down with a sickening finality, striking Abel with a force that reverberated through Cain's entire body. Abel crumpled to the ground, his staff falling beside him. The silence that followed was deafening. Cain stood over his brother's still form, his breath ragged, his mind reeling. The earth seemed to shift beneath his feet, as though recoiling from what had been done. Blood seeped into the soil, dark and glistening, a silent accusation against the one who had spilled it. Cain stumbled backward, his chest heaving. For a moment he thought he heard something, a distant cry, faint yet piercing. It was not Abel. It was the earth itself, groaning under the weight of this first terrible sin. He looked down at his hands, trembling and stained, and a single word escaped his lips. Why? But there was no answer. The land, once vibrant and alive, now seemed cold and lifeless. The sun hung low in the sky, its golden light unable to pierce the shadow that had fallen over Cain's heart. The confrontation. Then it came. A voice, not loud, not harsh, but cutting through the stillness like the first crack of thunder before a storm. Cain, the voice called. It was both question and statement, intimate yet infinite. Where is Abel, your brother? Cain froze. His body stiffened and his breath caught in his throat. He clenched his fists, dirt and blood mingling in his palms. I don't know, he replied, his voice hoarse, defiant. He turned his face toward the horizon, unwilling to meet the unseen gaze of his creator. "Am I my brother's keeper?" The voice came again, softer this time, but no less piercing. "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood cries to me from the ground." The words hit Cain like a tidal wave, but the voice continued, relentless in its pronouncement. "And now," it said, "you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the soil, it shall no longer yield to you its strength. You shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth." Each word struck him like a hammer against stone, shattering what remained of his defiance. Cain's knees buckled under the weight of the judgment, and he fell to the ground, trembling. His voice cracked as he cried out, "My punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, you have driven me away today from the ground, and from your face I shall be hidden. I shall be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." For the first time, Cain's voice was stripped of pride. It was raw, desperate, a man standing naked before the consequences of his sin. The voice replied, steady and resolute, yet tinged with mercy. "Not so. If anyone kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold." Cain's body slackened as the tension drained from him. A faint warmth spread across his brow, and though he could not see it, he felt the mark pressed upon him, a silent symbol, both of his guilt and his protection. The voice did not speak again, and the silence returned. This time, it was not the silence of peace, but of distance, a chasm now fixed between him and his Creator. Without another word, Cain rose to his feet and began to walk. Each step felt heavier than the last, the weight of the mark and his newfound isolation pressing down on him. Behind him, the fields of Eden faded into the distance, its fertile soil forever out of his reach. Ahead lay a wilderness, the first steps of a journey into the unknown, the first exile of mankind. The world continued on, but Cain walked alone, a fugitive not only from men, but from the face of God himself. The Wanderer. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a burnt orange hue over the barren land. The ground beneath Cain's feet was cracked and dry, its surface a tapestry of fractures that seemed to echo the fissures in his own heart. He walked without direction, his steps slow and heavy, each one pulling him deeper into the wilderness. The weight of what he had done clung to him like a shadow that would not relent, even in the waning light of day. "I am marked," he whispered aloud, his voice hoarse, breaking the stillness. The words fell flat against the empty landscape, as if the earth itself refused to acknowledge him. The stars above him, once a source of wonder, now seemed distant and cold, as if they too turned their faces away from him. The vastness of the heavens only deepened his isolation, a reminder of the God who watched yet felt so far away. At night, when the darkness pressed in, he would hear things, whispers carried by the wind, though there was no wind. The voice of Abel, faint and fleeting, seemed to call to him, though he knew it was only his mind tormenting him. Cain's story serves as a powerful reminder of how unchecked envy and pride can warp our hearts, leading us to make choices that we later cannot undo. His actions are a tragic illustration of how, when we let resentment take root, it can blind us to the love and humility that could offer healing and restoration. Rather than seeking reconciliation or understanding, Cain allowed his bitterness to fester, rejecting God's call to repentance. The mark on Cain, though a form of protection, is a constant reminder of the weight of his sin, not just on his body, but on his soul. It speaks to the irreversible nature of certain choices and how sin's consequences are not only destructive to others, but also deeply transformative within us. It's a call to turn away from the bitterness and anger that separate us from peace and grace, choosing instead the path of repentance, healing, and humility. Cain's story encourages us to reflect on the choices we make when we feel wronged or overlooked. It's a prompt to choose grace, to seek reconciliation, and to allow love to guide us through our pain, instead of letting bitterness drive us further away from God and each other.